My name is Ben. I work together with Bernardo, with Nabila, and Annika in the Innovation Facility. And it's our great pleasure today to welcome Anne May. Anne May has been a dear colleague and supporter of our work for the past years, starting when she was the director of the USAID Global Development Lab. And prior to leading up one of the largest development labs focused on innovation, Anne May worked for several years in Silicon Valley for different tech companies. Over the last year and a half, 2 years, Anne May collected case studies from across the world, from the development sector, to see how are frameworks of agile management being applied in the social good arena, and what can others, including UNDP, learn from that. For us as an organization, as we embark on the strategic plan and launch up new country platforms and a new initiative called the SDG Acceleration Labs, where experimentation is a core component, it's really important to learn from good practices on agile management, how to do development differently from other partners. So we're really, really excited that one day ahead of its formal launch, we have her book, Clean Impact, with us today, which is available for purchase after the event. Nice. And without further ado, Anne May, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you all for coming today. Can I drive? Okay. So, I spent, maybe I'll stand up so I can see everybody. So I spent most of my career in Silicon Valley. I studied as a software engineer. I worked at a bunch of big and small tech companies, most recently at Google for 8 years as an engineering director. And then 7 years ago, I decided to take a pivot and spend the second half of my career working on global poverty. And it was a little bit of a shift going from Google to the US State Department, if you can imagine. And, as I've been on this journey, one of the things that I discovered was that, whereas in Silicon Valley, there's been this incredible pace of progress, over the last couple dozen years that have, transformed the way we live our lives around the world, and, turn out, amazing innovations, even for the most mundane needs these days. And yet, in tackling some of the big challenges that we face around the world, I think that we're not keeping up. We're not able to innovate and drive change and drive progress nearly as fast. And my worry is that we're going to fall behind because the problems are getting more complex. They're more dynamic and changing more quickly. And so, what led me on this journey is as I learned more about the global development sphere and saw what was happening in it, I just saw such huge opportunity because I saw some shining lights, like some of the work being done at UNDP, that is really kind of driving to the next generation of what global development can look like. But I also saw the vast majority of what we do not being as nimble or as innovative or as, sort of embracing of those risks as we need in order to get to the results that we need to deliver. So I'll share a little bit about today, sort of kind of what I learned from interviewing over 200 organizations that I, kind of sought out who are kind of on the bleeding edge of this type of work. And what are some of the lessons that I learned from them, and what are some of the things maybe we can all think about as we take this forward. So, innovation has become such an overused buzzword in the English language. I mean, whether you're in business or you're in government or you're in the nonprofit sector, everybody's talking about innovation these days. When it comes to global development, I feel like innovation has been fairly misunderstood. That innovation has often meant, oh, we're going to use some flashy technology, we're going to have some hackathon, we're going to have some contest. And it often is more focused on the cool press release than actually sustainable impact at scale. And so I think we need to rethink a little bit what we mean by innovation. And to put that in context, I love this quote by Edison, which is, and I think it applies to innovation, that I would say innovation is also 1% inspiration, which is the big idea, or what I call the invention. And sometimes we conflate that with innovation. But the core of innovation, in my mind, is the 99% perspiration. It's taking that germ of a good idea and testing it, iterating, improving it, building the infrastructure, building the business model, all of the stuff that goes into taking that germ of a good idea and achieving massive scale. So if you think about it, companies like Google and Facebook are considered among the most innovative on the planet, right? But Google didn't invent search and Facebook didn't invent social networking. They were not the first. It wasn't like they innovated because they came up with this idea that no one had thought of before. That's actually fairly rare. But it's because they took those ideas and they continually improved on them by, modifying the user interface, the feature set, the algorithm, so that they became head and shoulders above their competitors. And I think that's what we need to think more about when it comes to innovation. So this book, Lean Impact, is actually inspired by another book. How many of you have heard of Lean Startup? Okay, a few people. So Lean Startup is a book that came out of Silicon Valley that really captured the best practices of how innovation works in Silicon Valley. And it's not rocket science. It's really based on the scientific method. And the idea is that in case conditions where you're working under conditions of extreme uncertainty, which exists when you are starting a tech startup company and trying to build a product or service no one has ever built before, or I would say equally, if not more true, in global development, where we are trying to solve long-standing intractable problems that we don't actually know we don't have sufficient solutions for yet. And so when you're working under conditions of great uncertainty, you need to take a different approach. And Eric kind of defined in the Lean Startup this kind of entrepreneurial version of essentially the scientific method. So the Lean Startup is really based on the scientific method. It's like if we don't know what's going to work, we need to run tests to test and figure out what's going to work. And our goal should not be to deploy as much as possible, but rather to learn as quickly as possible. And there's a real big difference in that. And so what I'm going to run through today is kind of 3 of the core principles that I distilled out from these interviews, from talking to different organizations. I'll talk about each of these. Let's start with is think big. So in the global development sphere and in the social sector in general, what I found is that we tend to think based on constraints, right? We have this much budget, we have this many people, we have a grant opportunity for this amount of money for this length of time, and we think, what can we do with that? And it's just like how a lot of programs that I've seen work, certainly at USAID. So one of the important mindset shifts is to go from a constraint-based planning approach to a needs-based planning approach, is to say, what is the size of the need in the world? What does it really mean to move the needle on a problem? If there is almost 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, what can we do that will actually potentially move the needle on that problem at a scale that will make a difference, and to a depth of impact that will make a difference? And so, the SDGs, I think, were fantastic as a way to set that bar, right? As a world, we've come together and say, this is the world that we want, and that we are going to stretch ourselves to try to create together across, 17 different goals. And I know you guys know all about the SDGs, so I won't dwell on it. But as we all know also, we're 3 years in and we are not on track, right? We're falling short on many of the SDGs. And people talk about this $2 to $3 trillion annual gap in funding that's needed for SDGs. And certainly we should try to get more funding, but I don't think we're going to get $2 to $3 trillion a year. I think another element that we don't focus on enough is that we need simply better solutions that can give us more bang for buck, right? That you're not going to close this gap just from money. You're going to close this gap in large part because of innovation, to find better and better solutions in order for us to get to our goals. And so just to put it in perspective, over the last 30 years, we've made slow but steady progress on some of these types of goals around things like access to clean water and electricity and sanitation. And we say that it's hard to do better than this because we're working with people who are very poor. They live in remote rural areas. It's hard to access them. But what's interesting is during the same time, adoption of mobile phones skyrocketed to many of the same low-income people living in the same rural areas. And so I think it's really instructive to look at what's the difference here. And in this case, I think part of the difference was, one, it was something people really wanted. People will choose mobile phones before they'll choose like water and electricity and sanitation in many cases. So it solved a real need for people, that they understood why it was helpful to them and they demanded it. The second is that there was a business model behind it. People would pay for their minutes, they would pay for their phone, and so it enabled companies to continue to invest both in developing better products, cheaper products, and distribute those products far and wide. And so certainly not everything's going to look like this, but I think it's an interesting challenge for us to take on, to say, how can we look at all the problems we're trying to solve and make it look more like that? And just to give a concrete example of what that looks like, because you're probably thinking, oh, we do a lot of things that don't look anything like mobile phones, so it's just different. I think an interesting example that that helps illustrate how this might work in more of the development space is the story of Vision Spring, which is a social enterprise. And so Vision Spring decided that what they wanted to focus on was a 700-year-old invention or innovation that has been proven to improve productivity and learning potential. But where 2.5 billion people could benefit but don't have it, and that's eyeglasses. Right? This is not some new fancy innovation. It's 700 years old. We know how to make eyeglasses, and yet 2.5 billion people yet who could benefit still don't have it. And so what did they do? They did what a typical nonprofit would start out by doing. They decided to start in a couple of geographies, El Salvador and India, and they set up people they called vision entrepreneurs to go out to rural villages and offer eyeglasses to people. They decided to sell them for a small, sort of very low cost to ensure that it was something that people really wanted and have them participate in the process. And they had great stories, right? They had stories of people who could, thought they were blind and could see again, people who couldn't work and now could work again, kids who could start learning. They had these great stories, and usually, nonprofits stop there, right? And they go, we've got these great stories. We're getting to these people. Let's get to some more people. Each year, we're going to get to 20% more people. But you'd never get to 2.5 billion people that way. And that's why there's still so many people that have glasses. So their first pivot was they recognized that they were losing money on every pair of glasses they sold. And so they would never be able to grow very fast because they have to keep raising grant money to do so. So their first pivot was to move to a hub and spoke model where they set up shops in more urban areas to and would take the profits from serving people who were more affluent with higher end products and use those profits to be able to do outreach to more rural areas. And so through this, they were actually able to get to a point of financial sustainability. So that was a huge step forward, even, for very few nonprofits get to that point. And so, they were doing really, really well. But yet they also recognized they would never be able to get to the 2.5 billion people and build out, it would take decades to build out the infrastructure to get to that many people around the world. And so they pivoted again. They decided now that they understood this model that they would work with partners. And so they had a partnership that they set up with BRAC in Bangladesh that has community healthcare workers in every corner of the country. And leveraging that existing network, they added eyeglasses and eye exams to their basket of goods and were very quickly able to get to people across Bangladesh. And together they've now sold over 1 million pairs of eyeglasses. And Vision Spring, through their other partnerships, has in total now sold over 4.5 million pairs of eyeglasses. Now, for a nonprofit, that's pretty good. 4.5 million people getting something that will really improve their lives. And eyeglasses are shown to be one of the things that's most productivity enhancing of all the different interventions that we might consider. But 2.5 million or 4.5 million is still far short of 2.5 billion. So their most recent pivot is they started to set up something called the iAlliance. That's a public-private partnership that brings in eyeglass manufacturers, governments, NGOs together to look at how to address the market and policy failures, right? That companies were not incentivized to produce low-cost enough eyeglasses and to distribute them to rural areas. So how do we address those issues? And governments were not necessarily providing their citizens with access to eyeglasses. And so their most recent, the iAlliance, one of their early wins was that they worked with the government of Liberia and have signed an MOU that now is including eye exams and vision care throughout the community health worker network, that the government network, and then also in public schools so that kids are actually having their eyes examined. And so now it's something that can spread nationally, and you can imagine that the similar thing could happen in other countries. So this kind of journey, I think, is really emblematic of what it looks like to, relentlessly pursue impact and really look at the big challenge out there, which is 2.5 billion people, and look at, how do we get the right approach that will help us get us there. So the second principle of lean impact is to start small. And this may seem counterintuitive. We just talked about starting big, thinking big. So why do we want to start small? Too often, in the global development space, we actually do the opposite. We think too small and we start too big. You get a grant or you get a program started, and basically you're held accountable to start delivering results. So you need to start delivering. And it doesn't leave you very much time to experiment and figure out better solutions. And so part of starting small is when you start small, when you're working with 5, 10, 100 people, you can much more quickly experiment. You're much more able to be nimble. You can take more risks, and you can learn more quickly and cheaply. And so even though it may seem counterintuitive, it's important both to think big, but also to start small. And what does this look like? So typically what we tend to see is that, we like to do a lot of planning in global development. In the walls of the building, we tend to have a lot of meetings, write a lot of documents, do a lot of detailed design, and we do all that stuff, and then eventually we deliver. And over that time, we've built up a lot of risk because there's, I know for myself, I can't get something in this complex right perfectly out the gate. And so there's a lot of risk that we built up and a lot of things that could go wrong. And then when they go wrong, they go wrong in a big way because there's, because we spent so much time and money getting there, we may be heading in the wrong direction. Instead, from a lean approach, what we want to do is to look at how we can de-risk. So rather than spending so much time planning in detail, getting out of the building, getting into the field, testing stuff with people, testing different variations. It could be as simple as a different color or a different message, or as complicated as a different type of intervention. But how do we test things out in the real world where there's numerous complexities that we just can't fully factor in on paper, and learn as quickly as possible and de-risk by running experiments, learning from that, and then running more experiments. And when something works, we can double down, and when something doesn't work, we can pivot. And so the core of lean startup is what Eric calls the build, measure, learn, feedback loop. And this is the scientific method. You have a hypothesis. You have a solution that you believe will work for a particular problem. You form a hypothesis about what you expect to happen. And then rather than just designing that at great length, go out and build a minimum viable product or a small experiment that tests that hypothesis. See, is this going to play out the way we thought? And then we measure the results. We gather data to see what happened, and then we learn. If it happened exactly as we thought, maybe we can double down. If it didn't work as we hoped, then maybe we need to tweak what we did, or maybe we need to take a dramatically different approach. And so the idea here is the faster you can go around this cycle, the faster you're going to innovate, right? And so the focus should be on the speed of iteration. A lot of times, we like to think through things and make sure we're doing everything perfectly. And so the shift here is to think instead about how fast can we go, how fast can we learn. And so when it comes to social innovation or global development, I would say that the things that we want to test fall along 3 different dimensions. And what I see is a lot of the toolkits out there and a lot of the organizations out there get 1 or 2 of these right, but rarely all 3. And the 3 are value, growth, and impact. Value is this something that people actually want and will demand, tell their friends about, come back for? Impact is, does it work? Does it have the social benefit that you hope? Growth is, if people want it and it works, can it scale? Can it get to a substantive portion of the need, like we talked about with Vision Spring? And if you miss one of these things, one of these dimensions, you're unlikely going to be able to move the needle. Sorry. So let's start with value. So is there demand? It's not enough for people to accept that you give them something for free, but one of the challenges in the social sector is a lot of times where the people who pay are not the people who benefit. And so we want to make sure that it's actually something that people really see value in, like mobile phones. And so they're going to use and take advantage of and apply in the ways that we hope. So, certainly one of the things, I know UNDP does this a lot, is proximity is important. We need to engage our users at every stage of the process, from the early design to testing and iterating to getting in people's hands and learning from them. And even when possible, having them help us design solutions. Because the people who are experiencing the problems are the ones that understand them the best and understand all the nuances. But one thing that we often don't do is look at behavior. We often focus instead on what I think of as hypotheticals. We ask people what they want, or ask people what they prefer, or ask people what they did. An organization called Nextleaf develops wireless sensors, and one of the things they use them for is to measure usage of clean cook stoves, which is one of those things that we've tried to do in global development is get people to use cleaner cook stoves to avoid the health consequences and also the pollution. But so when Nextleaf went to an area in India where people were using clean cook stoves, where clean cook stoves had been distributed, but only 10% of people were using them, they wanted to find out why. So they installed the sensors, and what they found out was that there was no correlation between what people said that they were doing, like how often they were using their cook stoves, and what they were actually doing. You know, some women would report that they were using them much more, some would report much less. There was just no correlation. And I think it was a really important insight to say, when you ask people what they do, or when you ask people what they want, there's all sorts of reasons they tell you something that's completely different than what is actually true. And so with the sensors, they were able to find out what was actually happening. And through that, ask questions, targeted questions that helped them elicit some of the design issues with the cook stove that they could then address, and were able to eventually get to close to 100% usage. And so what do these experiments look like? I'll give the example of what a MVP, or minimum viable product, could look like. In Kenya, there's a social enterprise called Copia Global, and they're trying to tackle the issue of getting a much wider variety of consumer goods to people who are living in remote rural areas, who often don't have very much choice of goods. And so, one way to do it is you could set up warehouses, you could build catalogs, you could create a whole distribution network, you could create a whole agent network so that you could sell your products. What they did instead was to first test out their hypothesis, test out this idea. Would people buy from a catalog? Would people sell from a catalog? What kinds of things would people buy? And so they ran a minimum viable product. And what that looked like was that, something they could do in the course of a week was that the CEO went to the local sort of Walmart equivalent in the city, took pictures of a bunch of products that he thought people might find interesting, pasted them in a few catalogs, maybe made like 5 catalogs or something, went out and gave them to some potential agents in the villages, and sat back to see what would happen. When someone would place an order, he would literally go to the store, buy the product off the shelf, and hand carry it to the village. Not something that could scale, but something that you could get going really, really fast. And so what did they learn? The first thing they learned is that people would order from the catalog. So the people started placing orders, he started fulfilling those orders. And so he was able to check that off, that hypothesis was proven. The second was that he learned what people wanted to order, so he could get a better sense of the product mix that he should focus on. And the third thing was, in terms of agents, they were surprised. His hypothesis was disproven, that in the case of agents, the agents they started with, of people who had kiosks and were selling things in the villages, they actually were not very motivated to sell from the catalog, because they much preferred to try to sell things that they were already carrying in their inventory. And so they would push people to their own inventory. What they found instead was that the best agents were actually people who had complementary businesses, somebody like a hair salon who had customers coming in, they would wait to get their hair cut, and they could flip through the catalog, and it was an additional source of income for them. And so by running this MVP in the course of a week, they learned a ton of things that helped them actually better direct their efforts as they started building out this business. So second, impact. There's a question like, does it actually work? And this seems like an obvious question. I know we often focus on it, but unfortunately we don't always focus on the question of, does what we're doing actually work? And part of it is that we tend to get very wed to our solutions. And I would say it's not only does it work, does it have the benefit that we want, but does it work as well as it possibly could? And I think part of what gets in the way is that we have a tendency to fall in love with our own solutions, that we have interventions we're comfortable with, we're familiar with, or that somebody's told us you should use this particular technology for. And we get accustomed to that, and we just kind of keep plowing forward. There's an interesting story of a friend of mine named Kinnari. She was interested in protecting the habitat of orangutans in Indonesia and Borneo. And so you would typically expect you run a conservation project, and there's all sorts of ways you run typical conservation projects. But instead, she went to the communities and lived there for several months and talked to the people to understand what was going on. Why was the rainforest being cut down? And it turned out one of the biggest drivers for deforestation was that when somebody would have a health crisis, and their family would have to rally to raise a lot of money to send them to a faraway hospital, pay for the transportation cost, and pay for the hospital cost itself. And the only way they could raise that money quickly was by chopping down trees. And so what she ended up doing instead was starting this nonprofit called Health in Harmony that would open a health clinic in the village to help address people's health problems and obviate the need for them to have to raise those extreme amounts of money. And so it's one of these examples that I think helps illustrate that, we need to hold on to our solutions more lightly and really focus on what's the problem and what's really going to work. And I think one of the biggest challenges with adapting lean startup to global development is that a lot of the things that we're trying to achieve take a long time. You're probably thinking that now, like these things are harder to measure, they take a long time, they're not like trying to create an e-commerce site. And so one of the tools for addressing that is the theory of change. It's something that we all create for our programs, but too often we create these elaborate theories of change and then they sit on the bookshelf somewhere. And so instead, the idea is to actually test each of the linkages in the theory of change from the very earliest stage. So this is a simple example of if you're trying to reduce the incidence of malaria by giving out mosquito nets, it may take you years to see if the incidence of malaria has gone down in a region, but you could find out tomorrow if people have hung up the mosquito nets and if they're sleeping under those mosquito nets. And so testing those early precursors doesn't guarantee you'll achieve the result, but if you don't have those precursors, it's unlikely you'll achieve the result. So how do we test those early things and not only test that they are happening, but maximize them and optimize them, right? So if 80% of people are hanging up their mosquito nets, how do we, or say 60% of people are hanging up mosquito nets, how do we get to 90%? Can we give out instruction manuals? Can we have, lessons in the village? Can we go hang it up for them? How do we get to a higher percentage? Because if you optimize this linkage, it's just like a sales funnel, right? That if you optimize the early stages and you have less loss each step of the way, you're far more likely to get to the positive outcome in the end. And so again, this is a trivial example, but I think as we look at the various different things that we are trying to achieve, it's important to look at what are those earliest precursors that we can start testing and get data on and optimize for before we go too far. So finally, we have an intervention, people want it, it works. So how do we actually get it out to the scale of people who need it, who can benefit, so that we're really moving the needle in the world? And as you guys are probably all very familiar, foreign aid is diminishing over time as a relative, maybe in absolute dollars to some extent, but more so as a relative to private sector flows, which are 10 times as much, and domestic resource mobilization, which is 3 times even greater than that. And so as the proportion of foreign aid becomes less and less, I think we just need to think of our role very differently. I know UNDP already does this, working with governments to leverage a lot of the domestic resource mobilization. But I think it's important for us to have that mindset shift, to think of ourselves not as the people who are going to provide the solution, but in foreign aid, what we can do is actually take more risk than local governments can or that private sector can. And so we can find the better solutions through some of the techniques for innovation, and then be able to scale them through the private sector or through local government. So what does that look like? Certainly the easiest, most straightforward model is if you can have a market-driven business model where people pay for your products, such as some of these companies doing off-grid pay-as-you-go solar systems. They figured out a business model that allows people to use mobile money to pay for their solar system over time. Sometimes people just can't pay enough for a particular product or service. So cross-subsidy is another model that Aravind Eye Hospital in India is one of the biggest, I think the biggest eye care network in the world. They do something like 300,000 eye surgeries a year, 3/4 of which are highly subsidized or free. And the way they do it is that they charge for people who come who can afford to do surgeries, and they charge a reasonable price. They get a private air-conditioned room. But for the people who can't pay, they can provide service for free by cross-subsidizing that, and they get the same high-quality service, but they just end up recovering in a shared ward rather than in their own private room. And so cross-subsidy is another way to do that, and certainly something that Vision Spring looked at as well. Replication is another way. Certainly if you're, again, Vision Spring went through that model of replicating by working with a number of different partners. Certainly it can take a long time to build up your own networks to distribute something. So how do you replicate through, in the case of microfinance, both for-profit and nonprofit entities? And also government spending, like how do we really leverage the government spending? I think this experiment happening in Liberia that's been somewhat controversial, but I think is really fascinating, is the Partnership for Schools Liberia, which has been renamed recently. And what they're doing is they recognize that the school system was failing. I think this is an amazing thing that the government was able to have the humility to say that, and brought in 8 both nonprofit and for-profit providers to take over schools and ran an evaluation alongside to see whether they did better. And they found that most of the providers did dramatically better than the government schools, in some cases twice as much educational attainment. And so over time, the hope is, again, politics aside, that the more and more the government schools can adopt these better educational paradigms. So finally, the third the principle of lean impact is to relentlessly pursue impact. So, in the sort of philanthropic charitable space, we're generally happy if we deliver some impact, because people, donate some money, they, do some work to, build a school or whatever, and they've done some good. But I think we need to raise the bar. So just as companies are required by regulation to maximize shareholder value and maximize their profits, I think that all of us working for good should be required to maximize the social impact that we are able to deliver for the resources that we have. And there's a lot of things that push against that. As I talked about earlier, it's important that we fall in love with the problem. Too often we get wed to whether it's a particular technology we want to use that may or may not be appropriate, or if it's a particular solution that we identify with, or even if it's your own organization that you want to have your organization have a particular role. These things can often divert us from coming up with the best solutions. There's oftentimes the best solution is something someone else came up with, and partnering with them or doubling down with them may be the better way to go, or open sourcing something to have other people be able to take it on. And I would say innovation starts with an audacious goal. Audacious goal is the foundation of innovation. President Kennedy in the US had this goal to send a man to the moon. When you have a goal in an organization, that is not something you can achieve with business as usual. It forces you to innovate. It forces you to take some risk and do something different. A lot of times I see organizations talk about, we want to innovate, we want to innovate, we want to innovate. And then when they come out with their goals for the year, it's like, we're going to do 10% better here, we're going to do 10% better there. And there's no reason for people when they go back to their desks to take the risk to do something else that might result in 50% better, because the goal is just 10% better. And you can sort of see how you're going to get there. So you just need to work a little harder, refine a few things, and you can get there. So, I think that culture change doesn't happen until we start shifting our idea about what success looks like. And success should be something that you can't do with business as usual, if business as usual is insufficient to solve the problems at hand. And once you have that goal, I think we also need to shift the way that we measure our progress. Too often when I look at the websites of foundations or government agencies or nonprofits, there's a big focus on on absolute numbers. This is the number of people we trained, we touched, we improved the lives of, and those numbers are meaningless. Like, what does it mean that you touched 50 million people's lives? Did their lives get better? Even if their lives got better, like, could somebody else have done more with the same amount of resources that you invested? Could they have made their lives even better? Could they have reached 100 million people? And even if you were able to reach a number of people, do you have an engine of growth that can scale to the size of the need? So these are things that they don't tell us. So instead, part of what Lean Impact talks about is focusing instead on innovation metrics, or which are typically unit metrics. So at a unit level, for each person you reach, or for each 100 people you reach, what percentage are seeing value in it and showing signs of that? How much does it cost for each incremental person that you reach? What is the success rate? When you identify those unit metrics and then optimize for those unit metrics, they pay dividends over time, right? So if you can go from 50% to 80%, that gets magnified as you roll out further and further. If you go from, $1,000 to $500, you can do twice as much with the same amount of money. So testing your hypotheses around ways to reduce your costs and ways to increase your yields and success rate are the kind of metrics that I think matter for driving greater success. And so I just want to wrap up by saying the goal in all this is to look at how do we move from some impact and knowing that we're doing some good to knowing that we're maximizing the good that we can possibly do, both from a depth and a breadth perspective. So I'm going to sort of end there, and then I'd love to hear what you guys think of this or any questions you have, and take it from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I suggest we're going to go with the Q&A, taking 3 questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
And
I need a pen
if you
then.
can just introduce yourself and where you work, and try to keep it concise. Yes,
There you go. Do you have paper?
well, we just go and other people, it's usually the first person needs to have the courage, so then we'll answer.
Yeah, because also I have to leave. Thank you so much. Very useful, Cecilia Milesi. I'm the Senior Advisor of Business Development at the Office of South Corporation.
Oh, great.
I have 3 quick questions. You talk a lot about need, demands, and incentives.
Uh-huh.
We work demand-driven in our programming in general, but what about human rights? How do you include human rights analysis and delivery on human rights in this model? Because we work under the assumption that the states have the obligation to provide education, water, etc. So how do you include that analysis? And the other one is context analysis. The examples that you give seems to be working on a stable context. So how do you do in context of conflict and crisis, which is most of the global South countries are affected right now. And then the last one, you know the UN very well, and we talk about the importance of organizational culture change. How an organization like the UN can, adapt to this kind of thinking, considering that member states sometimes or ourselves are against innovation or meeting the demands of the citizens.
Uh-huh.
Thanks. Since those were 3 questions, since you have to go, I just invite you to respond quickly.
Okay, sure. So let me maybe go from your last question backwards. So from a culture change perspective, I do think, and I've talked to a number of people throughout the UN system about this, is part of what needs to change. So one is that, changing the culture is not something that will happen overnight. And we should not let perfect be the enemy of the good. So the question is, how do we take steps towards creating a culture that is not just innovation in the flashy sense, but builds in the muscles for taking risk and experimenting and so forth. And part of that is like having it be a small piece of everything we do rather than something that's completely separate, I think. And part of that is, to my point earlier, is setting audacious goals that are not, so if you focus on unit metrics and you set audacious goals for those unit metrics that matter for whatever your program is, and say, how are we going to have the cost or double the success rate or whatever it is, and we're going to set aside some amount of our resources to figure out how to do that. And that starts creating a different culture change because people are held accountable to trying to figure out something different. It's just not usually what the reward system is. And I think that you fundamentally need to change the reward system if you want to actually change the culture. The second is absolutely in conflict situations, part of the idea of building in this agility is to both deal with what I think of intrinsic uncertainty, meaning that how we can get better even if everything stayed the same, but also deal with external uncertainty in terms of things changing. Is that if you have the data that allows you to monitor what's going on an ongoing basis, and you have the agility in your organization to adapt quickly when things change, those are the muscles that you need for both. And finally, on the human rights side, so this framework is not intended to address some of the things that you work on with human rights analysis. I'm assuming that framework is used in terms of UNDP working with governments on deciding what should be done, right? That we want to provide better education, we want to provide better healthcare. These are things that are basic needs that we want to provide for. What this framework is intended to do is figure out how do we do it, not what we should do. So if you have that framework and you say these are the things that people really should have, then we can experiment with different solutions to providing them. And this framework is intended to help us identify the best ways to do it.
Greg was up. So please.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Anne-May. I'm Steve Foslu from UNICEF. I'm a policy specialist there. So thank you very much. I really liked your point about the difference between what people say they do and what people do. I come from a user experience background, so we do user testing because what the focus group tells you and what the user does is different, So we live at a time now where we actually at scale have the potential to know what people do if we have access to the data of their behavior. But we also live in this time of real healthy awareness of people's privacy and data rights. And I was wondering if you had ideas on how we can navigate this, because I like that the sensor, with the in the kitchens. But imagine we could actually kind of tap into how young people are using social media at scale and get some of Facebook's data and get some of other people's data. So I was at an event recently at Facebook, a research event, and the room was about 30 people of researchers and then Facebook. And the research community is trying to work out adolescent well-being with the tiny bit of data that they piece together on the outside. On the other side is Facebook with all the data they need.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe there's a role for UNDP, UNICEF to kind of broker that. But how do we begin to kind of get some of that data that could really shift our programming and our policies in a way that's kind of in this particular context?
Yeah. Well, I think UNICEF has done some really interesting work in that arena. I know with the Zika outbreak, they got some data. They got Facebook to actually share data with them so that they could do trends analysis. And so I think that organizations are starting to try to figure out how to do this. And I think it is helpful to have institutions that can broker that, right? To ensure privacy and anonymity and all of those kinds of things are happening and protect the data. So I think it's absolutely an important realm to explore, and there's huge opportunity there. I think it's a longer discussion to get into some of the details of exactly how you protect the data in different circumstances. But I think it is important to protect the data. I think it's important to respect privacy, and I think there's a lot of upside to getting data. And there's ways that we found to do that, by sandboxing stuff, by anonymizing data, by having kind of trusted parties be able to get at things. But absolutely valuable.
Are you okay if I quickly compliment?
Yes.
Just like two tactical things. UN agencies have access to the Twitter house, thanks to UN Global Pulse, which has an agreement with Twitter. So we have access to all Twitter data globally. And we are working closely with the Network Association of all major mobile providers of GSMA, and more than 80 mobile providers across the globe have opened up their telco data in an anonymized, secure way for insights for social good. And UNICEF, UNDP, we are all part of that advisory board with GSMA to work on that telco data.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
That's fantastic.
Those are two tactical things, but in addition, what I recommend as a reading is the SDGs new strategy on new technologies, and it goes to your human rights point. I think particularly UNDP, but all UN agencies have a role to play here, not looking at new data as efficiency gain, but also what are risks? Are we setting ourselves up of the equivalent of driving industrialization and have polluted rivers and air a couple of decades later? So in other words, are we now pushing a data discourse and we are setting citizens, migrants, and refugees up for severe risks in the coming decades? So we have a normative role to play here, and that strategy spells that out. And we really have to think not only about efficiency gains, but of not only protecting privacy today, but setting as best as we can accountability system in place for the decades to come, because governance shifts can happen. Yesterday's election just showed that, right? So this is a real major role of us, and it's going to be a real issue for us to drum up interest and the mandate from member states for that. But that's one of the, I think, really important frontiers, not only on data, on biotechnology, nanotechnology, and other game changers that are coming. Please get the next presentation.
Hello, my name is Jose Crosssubsidy, and I work here at the Policy Bureau. I lead a team that does government reform. I have loved your presentation, especially because you have brought some really practical elements to the discussion of innovation. We have an administrator that champions innovation, so I think we have a great advantage in that sense. So my question is more, in a large bureaucracy, and given your experience with USAID, what are some of the steps that such an organization can take to ensure that this culture does permeate across the organization? Do you create a special budget? Do you appoint a special unit? Do you create a chief innovation officer? I'm just wondering what are some of the things that can have real value to ensure that people do begin to take these risks? How do you get that to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no one right answer to that. I do think that the most crucial thing is changing the incentives. That you can do a lot of other things, but if you don't fundamentally change the incentive structure of what people are rewarded for doing, and people are just rewarded for incremental progress, that everything else will not get very far. I think that there is value in both an innovation team that can bring together best practice. So think of it like any other sort of thing you might want to drive across the organization. Like, if you want to you may want to look at gender issues, or you may want to look at disability, or you may want to look at private sector partnerships. These are all things that I think are somewhat similar in that they're cross-cutting. And so I think with anything cross-cutting like that, it's helpful to have a central team that can bring together best practices and disseminate best practices and sort of be a pioneer. But then it's also helpful to permeate that throughout the organization over time. You wouldn't want it all to be centralized. And I think the same thing is true for innovation. So what we try to do at the Global Development Lab is we have the lab itself that was bringing together best practices, sort of trying to develop some of the cutting edge examples of what you might do in the context of USAID. But then we were really actively working with both our missions, which are like our country offices, and our pillar bureaus, like our sector technical offices, to integrate innovation experts and technology experts and so forth within their own parts of the organization, so that they could own it and have it be part of their responsibilities as well. So both are important. And the last thing I'd say is, whenever organizations talk about innovation, they first go to like a chief innovation officer, which I had that title, so I can't criticize too much, but they first go to like innovation lab or chief innovation officer. What I came away from USAID thinking was most important was actually procurement and HR. That you have to fundamentally change the systems, because those you can nibble around the edges with like an innovation lab, but unless you change the way you do procurement and the way you hire people and reward people, it's really hard to go beyond nibbling around the edges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I can imagine you're sensing that this room is concerned about human rights, about what social impact means, about unintended consequences. We do have a different mandate than the private sector, and we need to take into account those frameworks. So my question has to do with social impact. So, I mean, even if you take the SDGs as your framework, within the SDGs you have tensions, right, and contradicting results, right? So my question is, how do you get together an organization to make sure that you agree on what social impact means, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we work on ending violence against women, but the team across the alley is working on livelihood programming, and through their livelihood programming, which can be very innovative and they can be getting a lot of results, they could be putting women at risk of being, raped or being sexually assaulted. So what I'm saying is that sometimes slow is also a way to address those tensions that we haven't resolved. Not even the human rights framework has resolved it, not the SDGs. So how can you take into account those tensions that come from a holistic view
Yep.
that you always need to have.
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer part of your question, but I'll answer part of it. So I don't purport to like have the grand master plan for everything here, right? So as I said earlier, this framework is not intended to answer the questions of how do you make some trade-offs about do you prioritize A versus B. Those are, I'm assuming that people have come in, have with whatever framework is right for them, have decided these are the things that are important, and this is intended to tell you how to deliver on those. So we can have a debate about that, and I find it very interesting, but I'm not an expert in that. I'm more focused on the how do you get from point A to point B once you've decided where point B is you want to get to. But the part that I will talk about is this idea of how do we responsibly experiment? Because I think that's a question that comes up a lot when we talk about innovation, particularly in fragile settings and with vulnerable populations. And so I think there's a few important things to say here. One is that part of the reason to start small is that it allows us to be much more careful when we experiment. If you're trying something with 5 people, you can be much more vigilant about if there's unintended consequences than if you roll out a program to 10,000 people. And you can be much more vigilant to actually make sure people are made whole if something does inadvertently go wrong. And so it's part of the reason to start small in this context is exactly because we're working with vulnerable populations. We have to be careful, right? And think about it in the same way as like medical drug trials, right? Like, we do work with very vulnerable populations, and it is risky whenever you intervene in any way because there can be unexpected things that happen. It's the same thing when you're, testing drugs. The first time someone gets a vaccine, a human being gets a vaccine, there is a risk. That's why they only give it to a couple people the first time to see what happens. But if you never take that risk, there can be millions of people's lives that you lose because you never tried it. So you have to take the risk in as measured a way as possible, and you de-risk it along the way, right? You don't just give it to a million people and hope for the best. You try it in monkeys first, you try it in the lab first, you try it with one person first, then you try it with more people. You inch your way there to de-risk it each step of the way, and you watch very closely. And I think that the analog is very much true also for the kinds of interventions we do in global development, is to say, yes, any intervention we have is going to entail some risk. So how do we most carefully de-risk each step of the way and take small steps so that we understand what we're getting into each step we take? And I think, just like not making a decision is also making a decision, not taking a risk and not trying something and giving people something, solutions that are substandard is also causing harm, I would say. So I think we have a responsibility to find responsible ways to continue to try to give people better solutions to whatever issues we're trying to address. So sorry I didn't answer the first part of your question, but I'm not the expert there.
I am Smita Banerjee, and I work also with the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. You talked about starting small but thinking big, and I think as an organization, UNDP and I'm sure other UN agencies as well, we're actually not bad at experimenting and piloting. I think our problem is really the second part, which is going big and scaling up. Mm-hmm. So you said you looked at 200 organizations. So in your experience, when things actually succeed in going to scale, what are the ingredients that made that happen? What is it that makes that leap from a small experiment to something really big?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's usually that there's not one path to scale, so there's not one answer. I think it really depends on what you're doing. But I think there's a few elements. One is you have to be planning for it from the start. Too often I see organizations run a pilot, and the pilot succeeds, and they go, now let's figure out a scale plan. Like, it has to be built in from the start, because if your scale plan is you're going to sell something, you have to be selling it during the pilot. If your scale plan is you're going to have government adopt it, you have to be working with government from the start, right? So the first step is to, even from the earliest pilot stage, you have to have an idea of what your path to scale is, and you have to deliberately test that path to scale. Like, if it's somebody's going to buy something, are they going to buy it? If it's the government's going to adopt something, is the government able to afford it? Do they have the infrastructure to be able to deploy it? And so forth. So starting by identifying your potential path to scale early, having laying out your ambitions very clearly, like Vision Spring did, and then testing for those things as early as possible. And then what we need to look for is not just a brute force path to scale, which is I think what we tend to default to is like we need another dollar to get another dollar worth of benefit, but look for an exponential path to scale, which is that that growth will accelerate over time, not just scale linearly, because you're never going to get to the size of most of the needs that we're trying to tackle by scaling linearly. And a lot of times most often that involves either a private sector business model or some sort of like government policy change, either government adoption policy change kind of model. Good.
Okay, we take one more question and then we close it due to time, but please, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and also to the innovation team for always providing very, very stimulating speakers, and today was no exception. My name is Jessica Zimmerman. I'm from the gender team. So my question is about process, because you mentioned the feedback loop, and this is where, because I'm with you for everything else, particularly in this project we're working on, we're thinking big, we're, eliminating violence against women and gender-based violence by 2030. We're starting small. We've got these 7 pilots. But when I think about the feedback loop and just generally what I know about innovation is this idea to test and to test quickly and to fail quickly. And so what do you do when time is not on your side? Like what we're trying to do is address, social norms around gender inequality, structural violence. So the idea of failing quickly would be, say, 3 years, So what do we do? And I'm asking this because I think it's true, not just of the work that we're doing, but of, a lot of the development work that we do in general. So what do we do to accelerate those feedback loops when we're looking at really long-term changes? You touched on this a little bit, so I hope.
Yeah, I mean, the mosquito net example was intended, but I know that's a much more trivial example than some of the things you're dealing with. But I'd be happy to talk through with you the specific thing that you're working on, because it's hard to generalize. The reason I use the mosquito net thing is it's understandable to a lot of people. But the idea is really to look at what are those earlier precursors. When I talk about iterating quickly, we tend to iterate on the order of years in the global development space. And the question is, how do we get that down to days or weeks? Because that's a huge orders of magnitude, and that's how we're going to accelerate progress. And so, if you're trying to eliminate violence against women, what are the interventions you're doing, and what are the earliest indicators that intervention may be having some small change in the direction that you want that will eventually lead to less violence again, and how do you identify those things sooner and optimize for those things, right? You will never get to 100. I think a lot of times we're wanting to get to 100%, like, RCT level confidence that it's definitely working and it definitely changed the long-term impact. But that takes a long time. So how do we find those earlier precursors that are less certain, but that are leading indicators, if you will, that we can optimize for and learn from to be more likely to 3 years later have a good result. But happy to talk through specific circumstance.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I want to make an announcement for this Friday. We have a week with 2 innovation conversations, actually. On Friday, we're going to have a conversation on impact modeling. It's actually a pathway to kind of assess different pathways to impact through simulations and modeling, an approach that is not really done within UNDP, but in the financial sector quite a bit, and increasingly in the nonprofit sector, and of potential value, and has been proven to add value on gender equality, in the health sector, on poverty. So another new approach that could be of interest to some of the teams here. But with that, a big thanks to you, Anne. We have the books for purchase.
And Ben is selling books. How much are they?
21. That's how much I bought them for. That's how much I'm going to resell them. So,
and I'm happy to sign your book if you would like to get a copy. Be the first kid on your block with a book, because they come out tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.